Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Czech National Bank's meeting with analysts, whose main purpose is to present our first macroeconomic forecast of this year. First, I'd like to ask you to keep your microphones muted at all times unless you are given the floor. Now let me introduce our speakers for today. They are Czech National Bank Board member Oldřich Dědek, Executive Director of the Monetary Department Petr Král.
Hello to everyone.
And Director of the Macroeconomic Forecasting Division Karel Musel.
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Should you wish to ask a question today, please use the chat function in the lower right corner of your screen by sending me a message either with the word question or with the question itself in the chat field. For the sake of an easier identification, please enter also your name and the name of your company. I will be inviting you to pose a question in the order in which you asked for the floor. As always, we shall start with the presentation. Today it is presented by Petr Král, whom I will now make way for. Petr, you have the floor.
Thank you for the floor. Good morning once again from my side, ladies and gentlemen. The structure of my presentation will be such as follows. First, I will introduce the assumptions based on which the new macroeconomic forecast was prepared. Then I will give you an in-depth insight into the new macroeconomic forecast following the story, the plot of the macroeconomic picture and including the quantitative dimension of that. Third, I will provide you with a brief comparison of the new forecast with the previous one. And the final two parts of my presentation will be dedicated to further scenarios and simulations we prepare to illustrate the unprecedented uncertainty we are currently facing and monetary policy considerations we have done under these circumstances. The current economic situation and its outlook are still being fundamentally affected by the ongoing coronavirus pandemic and measures taken by governments around the globe against it. The nascent vaccination effort offers some light at the end of the tunnel, and we can expect that during this year the herd immunity will be gradually built in the world, including the countries of our major trading partners, which is the euro area. That's why the baseline scenario of this forecast assumes that the current containment measures will be only gradually and cautiously relaxed during the first half of this year, and some more pronounced relaxation or lifting of these measures will be seen in the second half of this year. And during next year, we expect or we assume that the globe, global situation will get back to normal life, and the social contact and intensity of mobility will return to the levels we saw before the coronavirus pandemic hit the world. Following these assumptions, so we can expect that the euro area GDP growth will almost reach 4% this year, and will stay there also for the next year. But the expected recovery in the countries of our major trading partners will not be enough to close the currently highly negative output gap before the end of the forecast horizon. The good news is that world industrial production and world manufacturing sector and the functioning of global value chains are exhibiting some relatively strong resilience towards the second or third wave of the pandemic, and this is pushing some upward pressure on industrial producer prices in the euro area, which together with the observed increase in crude oil prices will stimulate PPI growth in the coming quarters. But this renewed PPI growth will be still relatively muted due to the ongoing appreciation of the euro against the dollar and by the fact that the negative output gap will be closing only gradually, as I already mentioned. To the situation in the euro area, the ECB reacted by adjustment of its monetary policy and communication shortly before Christmas and adjusted its unconventional monetary policy measures, which are the asset purchasing program and pandemic emergency purchasing program. That's why the 3-month Euribor is in the negative territory for the entire forecast horizon, and following the existence of the unconventional monetary policy instruments used by the ECB, those two programs, the shadow nominal interest rates in the euro area lies well below the headline 3M Euribor rate, and will stay there for the rest of forecast horizon. As for the domestic pandemic situation, you know that the second wave during the autumn hit the Czech Republic very harshly, and the containment measures were taken against it, and they were gradually increased or tightened further during the autumn. After short relaxation before Christmas, those measures were again tightened at the turn of the year, and currently the stringency index, which is measuring the tightness of the containment measures, is culminating at the levels that are close to the spring last year. However, the second wave is somewhat different from what we saw during the spring last year, because the resilience of the manufacturing sector, which is a very important sector, especially for our country, up to now or so far, Czech manufacturing sector, export performance of Czech industrial production, and overall the activity in this sector has been growing despite the second wave of the pandemic, and the contribution of exports and net exports are very important for the overall economic activity at the end of last year and at the beginning of this year. So the negative contributions of the second wave of the pandemic to the gross value added generated in the manufacturing sector will be only negligible in the second wave, and the same is estimated for the rest of this year. Unlike manufacturing sector, the tertiary sector, services, retail, cultural, sport, and other events are harshly damaged by the containment measures, and as the anti-pandemic measures will be only lifted very gradually during the first half of this year, those negative contributions to gross value added in these sectors and subsectors will only gradually fade away, as you can see from the lower chart in this slide. The Czech fiscal policy has done a great effort last year to lean against the wind and to help stabilize the economy, and in the situation when the economy was severely hit by the coronavirus pandemic. The government consumption growth recorded a very high pace last year due to the increase of extraordinary spending on healthcare and in the emergency service sector. The growth of nominal government consumption will naturally slow down somewhat this year by this base effect or by the unusual high level in last year. Besides the government consumption as such, fiscal policy has made very strong positive fiscal impulse via fiscal discretionary measures taken by the government and the parliament on both revenue and expenditure side of public budgets. We estimate that this positive fiscal impulse reached almost 2 percentage points last year. As major of those stabilizing measures were approved to be only temporary, and they are expected to fade away during this year, we can expect that fiscal impulse will turn into negative territory in 2020, despite the fact that shortly before Christmas, the government and the parliament approved the huge fiscal package, including the abolition of the super gross wage as an assessment base for computation of personal income tax, which is leading to an effective decrease in labor taxation or wage taxation, and this specific measure is, let's say, acting in the opposite direction to that abolition or expiration of the previously approved measures. But as those tax cuts are expected to influence primarily the higher income brackets, we applied lower fiscal multiplier to that part of fiscal discretionary measures. As you know, we in standard times use fiscal multiplier of 0.6, which is used this time also with the exemption of this fiscal package, with the exemption of this effective tax cuts, for which we used the fiscal multiplier, which was reduced to half of that standard level, which is to 0.3. As you can see, the government support is primarily affecting the financial situation of households and its spending, but via programs to support businesses that are also severely hit by the downturn and by the closures and shutdowns. There is also part of the fiscal impulse stimulating private investment. We can expect that the government investment activity will continue in next couple of years, following the effort of Czech public authorities to draw down as much money as possible from the EU funds as we are approaching the terminal point of the current EU programming period. Now let me turn your attention to the macroeconomic forecast as such, to the baseline scenario of the forecast. As you know, inflation has returned to our tolerance band during the autumn and fell further in December, reaching 2.3%, which was a result of the strong deceleration of food price growth and decline in regulated price growth. We expect that headline inflation will decline further at the beginning of this year, and it will be hovering around the target during the rest of this year, and being slightly above the target in 2021 as a result primarily of increased excise duties on tobacco products. Monetary policy relevant inflation, which is headline inflation excluding primary effects of indirect tax changes, will be slightly below the headline inflation over the whole forecast horizon, reflecting the fact the increases of excise duties on cigarettes. As for the individual components of inflation, we can expect that core inflation, which has been quite high and quite stagnant over the last couple of months, will decline somewhat following the negative effects of the second wave of the pandemic and following the renewed appreciation of the koruna exchange rate against the euro. As the economy will subsequently recover from the pandemic, core inflation will stop falling and it will increase somewhat again during the second half of forecast horizon. The current dip of food price inflation will be only temporary, and food prices will start growing again as from mid of this year on the back of the renewed growth in agriculture producer prices. The currently muted administered price growth, which reflected the decline of in natural gas prices and electricity prices, will pick up again in the second half of this year, following the world energy prices outlook. Fuel prices will record temporary sharp increase in the first half of this year due to the base effect of the last year's strong decline of the crude oil price, which was during the onset of the first wave of the pandemic. After this short-term strong increase, we can expect some further stabilization of fuel prices at the filling stations. Let me now offer you a more in-depth insight into the factors, fundamental factors standing behind the described development of the inflation and its components. Here you can see that in the consumer sector, the growth of costs will ease somewhat and will stabilize when compared to the last year, when this growth was heightened and relatively volatile. The stabilization of the total costs growth in consumer sector will be driven by steadily slightly anti-inflationary effects of domestic economy. This will be accompanied by the gradual fading of the currently positive contribution of both core import prices and energy import prices, which will primarily reflect the appreciating koruna exchange rate. In the second half of this year, those import price contributions will even turn negative and will be dampen the overall inflationary pressures again as a primarily again as a reflection of the koruna appreciation, which is expected to continue against the background of still relatively subdued growth in PPI index in the euro area. Total growth in domestic consumer costs will stabilize then close to its steady state levels as from the second half of this year. Possibly a more interesting picture is here when looking at the costs in the domestic intermediate goods sector. As you can see, the growth in domestic costs has sharply decreased in recent quarters following the negative impacts of the coronavirus pandemic. This is being reflected primarily in the subdued dynamics in the fundamental wage growth, which will continue despite the increase of the minimum wage as from January this year. Fundamental wage growth, which is excluding statistical effects such as the effect of compensations paid to employees for being sick or for being at the obstacles on the employer's side. So after subtracting these one-off effects, we can see the fundamental wage dynamics, which, as I already mentioned, has declined recently and will only gradually recover during this year as the economy will get on a better footings after the pandemic is faded away during the second half of this year, and as the economy will be reopened again over summer. The reopening of the economy will be also reflected by the increase of the private consumption, which is reflected by the relatively sharp increase in the contribution of price of capital, as you can see from this graph. Simultaneously, the reopening of the economy and the return of people back to their workplaces, to the offices, shops, factories, and other premises will lead to a first gradual and a sharp increase in labor efficiency, which will have its standard anti-inflationary effect on the total growth in intermediate sector costs. The labor market has been exhibiting some negative effects from the sharp economic downturn we observed last year, despite the effort of the government to protect jobs in the sectors and industries which were primarily hit by the shutdowns and lockdowns. Despite these measures, the employment started to decline, and we can expect that the decline of the total employment will continue even for the whole this year, for the whole year of 2021. Sorry, and the cooling of the labor market is also reflected by gradual increase in the rate of unemployment, which will continue growing even for some time in the future. Wage growth in the market sector, when expressed in a fundamental terms, will continue to decline. As I already mentioned, and the statistically measured or officially measured wage growth will be very volatile because of those statistical effects. Beyond the effects of care benefit and other pandemic-related factors, there is one more specific factor we have taken into account when computing this this statistically adjusted or fundamental wage growth, which is the tax optimization of the firms following the huge cut in wage taxes as part of the firm's as we expect, will shift their performance bonuses from the end of last year to the first quarter of this year. But this is only a time shift, which is making the official time series volatile, but it is not influencing the fundamentally expressed wage dynamics. In non-market sector, we can expect that we can expect that the wage dynamics will also be relatively volatile and will gradually decline compared to what we saw in last year. As for the GDP, we can expect that the worsening epidemic situation in the second wave of the pandemic leading to the renewed shutdowns in the domestic economy is kind of prolonging the recovery of the economy from the first wave. As you know, the latest available figure for the GDP in the fourth quarter, which was zero quarter-on-quarter, which was 0.3% in terms of quarter-of-quarter change, was relatively good, but and this is possibly the result of still very well-functioning domestic manufacturing sector, but during winter, the continued and tightened shutdowns will definitely have some negative bearing on the whole domestic economic activity. But the export-oriented industry will generate some positive contribution to both industrial production and GDP as such via positive net export contributions. And following the expected reopening of the economy around the summer, we can expect that the economy will start growing in a more sustainable way, leading to the growth of GDP to be slightly above 2% for this year as a whole. Economic activity the growth of economic activity will accelerate further in 2022, and the GDP will reach its pre-pandemic level in the second half of next year, and the negative output gap will be closing at that horizon. As I mentioned, the GDP recovery will be driven primarily by net export contributions initially, but after that also private consumption and overall investment activity will make a positive contribution to GDP growth. Household consumption will return to sustained robust growth this year, as the adverse economic impacts of the pandemic will start to fade away in the second half of this year, and household consumption will reach its pre-coronavirus level in 2022. Domestic private sector, the corporate sector is very strongly negatively influenced by the shutdowns, and the sentiment of firms has worsened rapidly, which is curbing their investment activity. That's why we expect that this year the overall investment activity in the economy as a whole will be driven by government sector, whereas the private corporate sector will in terms of economic activity will still be very careful. But after the pandemic is away, also corporate sector will start invest more compared to the current situation. As I mentioned, the export side of the economy is doing very well recently. We are close to the pre-pandemic level in terms of total exports, and we expect that we will get not only to the pre-pandemic level but almost to the pre-pandemic trend, which is relatively very impressive, as the global value chains are still functioning. The freight transportation doesn't face any obstacles at the frontiers, at the borders, and export performance of domestic manufacturing sector that's why very strong. Import growth will accelerate simultaneously with the export side, being also gradually fueled by the renewal growth in domestic demand, especially in the investment activity of private firms. Koruna appreciated somewhat since the autumn as the sentiment towards the countries in our region has somewhat improved. The short-term forecast for the first quarter of this year is set at 26.3 crowns to the euro. The recent appreciation reflects the strong resilience of the Czech export-oriented manufacturing sector despite the continued adverse epidemic situation. And the receding of the pandemic together with the reopening of the economy and improving financial market sentiment during this year will lead to the continued appreciation of the koruna. That's why we expect that the trend will continue, being subsequently supported by the widening of the interest rate differential of the koruna vis-à-vis the euro. And that's why the koruna is expected to appreciate slightly below 25 crowns per euro at the end of the forecast horizon. Consistent with the forecast is stability in market interest rates initially, followed by a gradual increase in rates from roughly the middle of this year onwards. The initial stability of market interest rates reflects the need to keep monetary policy easy in a situation where the pandemic is having negative impact on the domestic economy. The subsequent gradual increase in nominal interest rates or normalization, the start of normalization of interest rates stems from the expected recovery of the Czech economy and from the fact that the inflation will be firmly anchored close to the target at the whole forecast horizon. Let me now briefly compare the new forecast with the previous one. Here you can see the major changes in the forecast in the most important domestic endogenous variables. Headline inflation in the new forecast will fall more markedly this year due to lower growth in food and administered prices. Next year, on the contrary, it will be slightly higher owing to the newly incorporated increases of the excise duties on tobacco. The outlook for domestic economic activity has been shifted upwards due to less devastating effects of the pandemic in the second half of last year. By the way, the recent available figure for the fourth quarter being 0.3 was pretty in line, broadly in line what we anticipated as we predicted flat reading for the last quarter of previous year. So from this point of view, the forecast is still holds in this respect. Because of the less devastating initial condition, the outlook for GDP was revised upward consistently on the whole forecast horizon. The higher wage growth in the new forecast compared to the previous one is a reflection of the better economic prospect and by the fact that we incorporated in the new forecast the increase of minimum wage by more than 4% effective as from January this year. The koruna in the new forecast will be somewhat stronger due to its appreciation at the end of last year and at the beginning of the new year, which is reflecting the unexpectedly good situation in the Czech export-oriented manufacturing sector. And in the second half of the forecast horizon, the appreciation and the stronger levels compared to the previous forecast is driven by somewhat wider interest rate differential against the euro. When looking at the interest rate trajectory as such, we can see only mild changes when compared to the previous forecast. When looking at individual factors describing or standing behind the new trajectory of interest rates, we can see that more relaxed fiscal policy fosters higher interest rates via both higher government consumption and less restrictive fiscal impulse. Fiscal impulse of minus 0.3 in the new forecast is relatively different from what we had in the previous forecast, where we expected the fiscal impulse of minus 0.3 because the previous forecast did not include the huge fiscal package approved at the end of last year. Faster recovery in household consumption and generally easier labor market conditions will foster higher rates next year, which will be offset by the worst course of the pandemic situation in the current quarter. This effect, initial conditions together with pandemic situation, is expressed here in the joint category of initial conditions, GDP and wages. The foreign or external side assumptions are making slightly negative contribution to the change of interest rate trajectory, as the foreign output gap will be slightly lower or will be closing more gradually compared to the previous forecast, and the expected shadow interest rate of the ECB will be somewhat lower compared to the assumptions of the previous forecast. The short-term outlook for domestic inflation is also making a negative contribution in this respect, reflecting the last observed inflation data, which was surprised us on the downside somewhat due to the more market deceleration of food prices than we had anticipated in our previous forecast. Let me now show you a scenario which we prepared to illustrate the major uncertainty we faced during the preparation of the forecast. This scenario is describing a situation of a longer-lasting downturn of domestic economic activity, which is induced by the slowly fading pandemic situation in both Europe and European and domestic economy. To be more specific on the assumptions of this scenario, this simulation assumes that the pandemic assumptions of the the pandemic assumptions will differ from the baseline scenario as from the second quarter of this year. This scenario considers marked deterioration in industry in addition to a more protracted decline in services abroad. Worse economic prospect and tangible effects of the financial situation of consumers and firms will be reflected in a decline in private consumption and corporate investment. In this scenario, we are leaving the assumptions that the global value chains will not be affected by the coronavirus pandemic, and this scenario is assuming that global value chains will be disrupted and the intensity of international trade will decrease. Slower economic recovery in the euro area, reflecting from these assumptions, will be reflected in stronger and longer-lasting anti-inflationary demand effects that the euro area will face. For the domestic economy, this scenario works with the worsened assumptions regarding the euro area, and besides these, there are also some worse assumptions regarding domestic pandemic situations, which are reflecting longer-lasting and more broad-based shutdowns, lockdowns in the domestic economy. Businesses will be exhausted by the prolonged pandemic situation, and some will have to close. As I mentioned, in contrast to the baseline scenario, industry in this simulation will face fall in demand from abroad. Domestic economy will therefore shift to a longer cyclical downturn, despite the easing of epidemiological measures to be lifted at the end of the day in the second half of 2021. Let's have a short look at the external assumptions of this scenario once again. The slower economic recovery in the euro area is characterized by a more negative output gap, which is in place until the very end of forecast horizon. Produce price inflation is more subdued as the economy is in a more less dramatically recovering in this scenario, and the world energy prices are also expected to decline again in this scenario. This scenario is consistent with the further easing of monetary conditions by the ECB, which will use unspecified combination of its instrument to react to that situation, which is reflected by a further decline of shadow interest rates. Slower growth of the Czech economy in this scenario compared to the baseline derives first from the weaker external demand, but also domestic demand situation is much worse in this scenario. The worse sentiment of firms and income situation of households, together with negative consumer appetite, will cause investment to freeze and will lead to lower household consumption. The lower demand for domestic production and slower wage growth will foster lower overall inflation pressures. Conversely, core import prices will have an inflationary effect due to weaker koruna. The adverse cyclical developments abroad are making the koruna to appreciate more slowly compared to the baseline. The long-lasting economic downturn then generates a need for easier monetary policy conditions, which will be delivered not only by weaker koruna exchange rate, but also by the lower level of domestic nominal interest rates compared to the baseline scenario. And finally, let me illustrate some monetary policy considerations we had with the board during the preparation of the February monetary policy meeting. Our forecasting apparatus enables us to simulate various scenarios in which the monetary policy can somewhat deviate from the optimal reaction function as described in the core model. In this scenario, we were putting the monetary policy under situation in which it will somewhat wait until the evidence of the fact that the economy has been successfully recovered from the pandemic is really convinced and is really conducive. And that's why the monetary authority in this scenario holds off from hiking of interest rates until the end of this year, only after there are some proofs that economy is definitely out of the wood. So this is kind of safeguard for the monetary authority to not to tighten monetary conditions prematurely. But the price of this safeguard is the fact that if everything is going in line with the baseline scenario, including the foreign economic and pandemic situation and following the domestic pandemic situation, then such a waiting is generating less optimal monetary policy reaction, which is generating some upward pressure on inflation on the monetary policy horizon. That's why CPI inflation is almost 3% in 2022 and is only gradually returning back to the baseline scenario. That's why the monetary authority has to react to that outcome by increasing the nominal interest rates faster than in the baseline scenario in the next year, getting slightly above the level from the baseline. The initial lower nominal interest rates are leading to some weaker koruna exchange rate compared to the baseline, which is making the upward pressure on the overall inflation, as I just said. Having said that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I am passing the floor back to our spokeswoman, Markéta Fischerová.
Thank you, Petr, for that comprehensive presentation. Now let's move to the Q&As, and the first question comes from Jakub Seidler from ING. Jakub, you have the floor.
Hello, thanks for presentation. I would like to maybe ask about the GDP projection in 2021, which, to be honest, surprised me a little bit on the downside, given the fiscal scenario which you provided in November forecast. Because if I may remind, you expected 1.7 GDP growth in 2021, but in fiscal scenario, assuming fiscal easing, the growth of GDP would be around 0.5 percentage point higher in 2021. So basically, where we are now, after the fiscal package was approved, but it does not take into account any other change in the forecast and more optimistic outlook due to arrival of vaccination. So I would like to ask basically what is behind this kind of relatively muted GDP growth for 2021, given the assumption in November forecast and how the situation changed since then. Thank you very much.
I will start, and I maybe ask my colleague Karel Musil to add some details. Basically, the autumn fiscal scenario was a kind of mechanical exercise in which we use the standard fiscal multiplier of 0.6 to the whole fiscal discretionary measures that were making the alternative assumptions of the fiscal side in this scenario. But since then, we have we had to rethought the way how we work in individual fiscal discretionary measures in the forecasting exercise, and we were especially paying attention to that tax package, which, as you know, is decreasing the tax burden or increasing net income for higher brackets, especially for higher brackets, due to the abolition of the super gross wage as a assessment base for the computation of personal income tax. Having this in mind, so that higher income brackets tend to have lower propensity to consumption and possibly higher propensity to savings and higher propensity to consume luxury goods from imports, we reduced the level of the fiscal multiplier attributable to this part of fiscal discretionary measures from the standard value of 0.6 to the reduced value of 0.3. That's why the fiscal impulse in the new baseline is minus 0.3 and not 0, which was the result of the autumn fiscal scenario. And there are also some marginal changes in the composition of the fiscal impulse after we incorporated some more support programs approved by the government in recent weeks and months to cope with the effects of further closures and shutdowns in various domestic industries. So this is the fundamental change between autumn fiscal scenario and the current baseline. The initial condition is also playing some important role, and Karol maybe will be more specific on this. And as for the vaccination assumptions, I would like to remind you that the autumn forecast made no explicit assumptions about the availability of the vaccine or about the vaccination process as such, because at those times we didn't want to predict this kind of unpredictable social or medicinal kind of thing. Here in this baseline, we already have some explicit assumptions about the building up of the herd immunity in both European countries and the Czech Republic following the vaccination process, which may sluggish, maybe sluggish somewhat, but the baseline takes the assumption that the herd immunity will enable to reopen the economy starting from summer this year, and the lifting of the containment measures will continue during the rest of this year, leading to the fact that we will get back to normal life in principle in 2022. Would you like to? That's.
Can I just one follow-up question, please? This is exactly what I said, that November forecast did not assume the vaccination. So basically, which came after the release of November forecast. And from this perspective, assuming now that economy would be opening in the second half of the year, I consider only 1.2 quarter-on-quarter growth in the third quarter and fourth quarter relatively muted. So still, I believe that the vaccination brought much more optimistic outlook for the growth, which I do not see much in new baseline scenario.
But the autumn scenario, but the baseline scenario from the autumn forecast was not saying anything about the effect of the vaccine on the pandemic situation. But the baseline scenario of that forecast was assuming also that anti-pandemic measures will be lifted during this year. That baseline was not consistent with having strict containment measures in place for the whole forecast horizon. The autumn forecast also predicted some relaxation of containment measures during 2021. So from this point of without having an explicit assumptions about the vaccination process.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Next, there are two questions by Mrs. Agata Urbanska-Giner. I will ask the questions on her behalf. The first question comes from her to Mr. Dědek, and Agata is asking, how did the board find the second alternative scenario with bigger monetary stimulus? Do they agree with the forecast of inflation rising to 3%? And if so, do they find this as reasonable risk to take against the risk of premature normalization?
I think if I can summarize some key points in the Bank Board yesterday decision making. So I think that the key assumption is that we live in extreme uncertainty. Okay, so for us, these scenarios and the forecast is a starting point for the discussion. And each decision making is unique. Okay, so we take for granted that we have a forecast. Of course, the forecast covers 1 year and a half, so it's quite logical that it has to take into account a point where the consolidation will start, okay, by definition. And of course, the question is to what extent the situation will evolve according to this baseline scenario. Therefore, we have these simulations, and we will see what the new incoming data will be. So I think that the story is okay if we assume that when this epidemic constraint will be lifted, that the economy will recover. I think that it's quite logical that if we will be more cautious with interest rate increases, that in theory or in the forecast it may have some impact on the inflation. But even though if I take into account the implication for inflation, so probably you notice that the inflation will stay within our fluctuation band. So this scenario, I think, absolutely should not be read that the bank board will sacrifice the inflation target, okay, in order to prolong this relaxed monetary policy for longer than needed.
Thank you. And the second question from Agata Urbanska-Giner goes to Petr Král. In your presentation of the forecast change between November and February with regards to the 3-month PRIBOR, there is not much contribution there from the foreign exchange, despite significant change in the foreign exchange forecast. Why is that so?
The exchange rate is an endogenous variable reacting to the all relevant macroeconomic factors, including exogenous factors that are typically shown here as a driver of the interest rate forecast change. The only way where the exchange rate can influence the change in the interest rate path is when the near-term forecast set exogenously is different from what the model would predict itself by taking into account all relevant macroeconomic factors from domestic and external economy. And currently, the level of the forecast as at 26.3 is broadly in line with how the model sees the fundamental level of the exchange rate reflecting the domestic and foreign macroeconomic forecast. That's why the exchange rate is not generating any tangible influence in this decomposition. Karol, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I just confirm that really the outlook of the exchange rate as it was set and assumed for the first quarter of this year, which means 26.3 crowns per euro, is really consistent with the trajectory of the endogenous trajectory of the interest rates, which means that there is no contribution neither to higher rates nor the decline in the rates.
Okay. Agata Urbanska-Giner thanks for a very clear answer on the foreign exchange and has one more follow-up question regarding the alternative scenarios. She's asking whether they are defined or asked for by the board or whether they are proposed by the research staff.
Typically, when preparing the forecast, we have two meetings with the board to share with them the initial conditions and external assumptions of the forecast and the plot of the baseline scenario, which is let's say being prepared during the preparatory phase, and we ask the bank board for the feedback on the assumptions and setting of the initial conditions and on the baseline as such. And the board is expressing its views concerning the potential balance of risks of such a defined baseline scenario, and we discuss together whether we can somewhat address the potential issues and potential uncertainties and risks by providing them with another simulation or another scenario besides the baseline. This time, the topic of the new forecast was clear. This is the ongoing pandemic situation, which is evolving from day to day, and we were together with the board discussing whether the assumptions on the vaccination process, whether the assumption on the ongoing resilience of the domestic manufacturing sector, whether these assumptions are robust enough to be true, or whether there is some risk in these assumptions. That's why we offered an alternative scenario, or this longer-lasting downturn scenario caused by caused by the longer pandemic, and the board has accepted our offer. The same is true for the monetary policy simulation. We were discussing the optimal timing of the start of normalizing monetary policy with the board. The board members discuss it among each other at previous monetary policy meetings and at this meeting also, and we felt that such a type of simulation could somewhat facilitate the debate of the policymakers.
Thank you. And the next question will be raised by Petr Dufek from CSOB.
Good afternoon. Can you please show us the slide of the second simulation, which is quite interesting for me because, as I understand well, it's a baseline scenario but without any rate hikes. And in my view, there is a quite interesting result. And when we look at the PRIBOR figures, in case of no rate hikes in the second half of the year, the inflation will nearly immediately jump by 1 percentage point. In my view, your calculation of sensitivity of inflation on interest rate changes is quite high, because when I look at the exchange rate, the change of the outlook of the koruna is nearly negligible. So it means that the inflation is so sensitive on immediate changes of interest rates on the market as well as on the rate hikes, because in my view, it's nearly impossible to see such a jump. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. The important thing in this scenario is that the simulation is made. The simulation is assuming that this monetary policy reaction is fully anticipated or almost fully anticipated by the markets and by the economic agents as such. So this attitude of monetary authority to wait until they are fully persuaded that the pandemic is away is in this scenario assumed to be fully communicated and fully understood by the economic agents and by the markets. That's why the reaction of the economy is much more pronounced compared to the possible alternative specification of that scenario in which those monetary policy shocks would be fully unanticipated. That's why the reaction of the exchange rate is relatively swift and persistent and significant, and that's why the inflation as such is relatively very soon deviating from the baseline scenario. Would you like to add something on the technical aspects of the scenario?
Just when you think about the magnitude of the change of the inflation, it's not really, as Peter mentioned, not only about the first or second quarter stability of the interest rate, but really because of the expectation feature of this stability or simulation. It means that really that's the result of the stability of the interest rate throughout the whole year, and then the impact on the inflation is in this magnitude.
So can you please explain me the channels of inflation? Because still I can understand that the market can expect some rate hikes, but at present not such a huge amount of them as you presented in your base scenario. So therefore I would like to know where, in which goods or services will probably jump up after the slight delay, because in my view it's only slight delay of rate hikes, because when we look at 2022 we can see that even in this sensitive scenario interest rates will go up to the same level as in the base scenario.
In this scenario, you cannot. We do not present the deviation of the modeled monetary policy reaction from the currently expected market path. This is simulation showing the difference between the baseline scenario and this simulation. And in this simulation, the waiting for the period of lagged or of the in which the monetary policy does not react to the inflation outlook is long enough to generate depreciation deviation of the exchange rate, which is pushing some upward pressure on the inflation via standard exchange rate pass-through or via standard import price channel, together with the fact that everyone is knowing in this scenario that the monetary authority will tolerate inflation going somewhat above the target, not above the upper boundary of the tolerance band, but going almost to 3%, which is also affecting their inflation expectations and wage negotiations. And via all these channels affecting the final CPI outcome, this scenario is influencing the deviation of the simulation from the baseline. So it is very important to know that in this scenario, everyone knows that the monetary authority will deviate from the optimal reaction to be assured that the pandemic situation is successfully away and that there is no risk of premature tightening of monetary conditions under such an unprecedented uncertainty that we are all facing currently.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, was that sufficient? Right. Okay, would there be another question, please? I can't see anyone. Okay, if it's not the case, let me raise one topic which is important from our point of view. Starting from this year, our new flagship publication on monetary policy will be the Monetary Policy Report replacing the inflation report published since 1998. It offers a deeper insight into our macroeconomic forecast and monetary policy making, and our ambition has been to make it easier to understand and read. Yesterday we published a blog on that topic, and today you are able to read also the first chapter of the new report penned by Petr Král in a very informative and clear way. The report itself, along with a press release and a vlog, will be published next Friday. And I have a question for Petr. What was your actually team's motivation behind switching to the new report?
When being in the inflation targeting regime since 1998 and when having our inflation report in place all the time, we gradually got to know that the standard in most advanced inflation targeting central bank is moving from pure descriptive type of writing of reports to more focused and more analytical kind of writing, enabling the audience or the reader the possibility to let's say to see how the monetary authority is thinking about the current economic situations, what are the current hot topics which are influencing the economic situation and the outlook for inflation and for monetary policy, and what is standing behind the ultimate monetary policy decision, which is the discussion among board members on the risks and uncertainties surrounding the baseline scenario. That's why we are in this format more able to share with the audience the internal kind of thinking, and including this type of simulation we have just discussed here. That's why we followed the good example of such foreign central banks such as Sveriges Riksbank or Bank of England, who have been using monetary policy report successfully for many years, and this is, as I see, a further step to increase already high transparency of the Czech National Bank's monetary policy.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Dědek, how do you or the board see the change? How do you perceive it?
Okay, I think that this monetary policy report is another step in our attempt to improve the communication strategy. Probably you know that some time ago, I think it's 1 year time, we started publish these attributed minutes. Okay, so I think it is a quite substantial steps towards greater openness of the Czech National Bank. And now the next step was this monetary policy report. From my point of view, I think that this report serves two purposes. As on the one hand, the monetary department has the obligation to brief the bank board, okay, to supply the necessary data, important data for decision making. And at the same time, this report should serve the public as to understand what is happening on. And I think that this report finds a good compromise between these two objectives. So together with this report, the bank board has at its disposal a set of accompanying studies, covering different fields of the Czech and world economy, and this report concentrates. I would call it it's issue based. Okay, so it selects the most important things, which are really important for decision making. If somebody is interested in other areas which are not so acute, of course, we have another set of informations available. So I will not give the full grades, because I think it depends on users. So of course we are waiting for the feedback from you, okay, from you as a watchdogs of the Czech National Bank, but I think that from the point of view of the bank board, we were quite happy with this improvement.
Thank you very much. In the meantime, there is one more question, this time by Jaromír Šindel at Citi.
Good morning. I'm sorry I was so focused on the discussion that I forget to ask. I have actually 3 questions. Two are quite short, I would say. The first is, I know the Czech consumer prices are not going to change the weight regarding the consumer basket composition. But for example, in Eurozone or HICP index, let's say, faces something like the changes in the consumer basket composition, and it led to the higher growth of consumer prices in these terms. So the question is whether this has somehow influenced your decision making. The second question would be about the discussion about the composition of inflationary pressures, because in previous meetings you highlighted quite high uncertainty regarding the composition of the inflationary pressure. So I would like to ask you, how did you revise the potential output or potential growth of the Czech economy in your baseline scenario? And how do you see this composition now in the Czech economy? And the third question would be, if you look around us, your forecast suggests enormous tightening of the monetary conditions, definitely compared to the Western Europe, but there is ECB and the Eurozone has its own problem, but also to our peers like Poland or Hungary. So what would you highlight as something like exceptionalism of the Czech economy against these 2 economies in Poland and Hungary that would satisfy such a tight, let's say, monetary conditions in future? Thank you very much.
As for the change in the composition of the consumer basket, which is used for measuring CPI inflation, we didn't have any discussion on this topic during this forecasting exercise. So there is no to add on that. There is nothing to add on that. As for the composition of the inflation pressures standing behind the observed domestic and foreign price developments, it's true that this is still a source of huge uncertainty. As you can see in this graph, we have been gradually moving over time from the initial, let's say, position that the last year a huge economic decline was almost fully attributable to the opening of the negative output gap, or to the opening of the output gap to negative territory. And as you can see by comparison of the new forecast with the previous one, we have somewhat shifted the initial condition of the output gap upwards, having seen that the decline of the economy in the euro area did not have such a cyclical anti-inflationary effect and demand effect on inflation and on the labor market as we would normally anticipate from such a strong GDP decline. And the same is and the subsequent swift recovery of both foreign and domestic economic activity during summer, when majority of containment measures was lifted for some time, was saying us that this might be really this might be consistent with increased volatility in the potential output level rather than in the more pronounced decline in the output gap. That's why the initial condition is less anti-inflationary in the new forecast when comparing the actual level of the negative output gap with the previous one, and the same is true for both foreign economy and the domestic economy. But until we are far away from the current situation, we cannot say for sure how devastating was the pandemic crisis on the cyclical position and the condition of the economy, and to what extent the fluctuations could be attributable to the fluctuations of the potential output. That's why we are moving over time. We are studying data, studying literature, and observing some other analytical places such as the IMF or the ECB, which are also somewhat moving from the initial position in which they saw the negative output gap to get opened more to a negative territory, to this kind of milder cyclical kind of effect. But we will definitely know the truth only after we are through 2 or 3 years in the future, and after all the standard reactions of the economy to the decline of the economic activity will be seen in retrospect, and this is that's why still a source of a huge uncertainty when preparing the forecast. But this is something which is, as I see it, already standard way or standard part of our routine work. That's why we did not want to emphasize this specific source of uncertainty in the public communication. And as for maybe one remark on the let's say on the comparison between our monetary policy and monetary policy in the countries of our region, is that the Czech National Bank has traditionally been relatively well determined to inflation targeting framework, paying primary attention to its mandate of maintaining price stability, which is possibly making us more different from other central banks around us. But Oldřich Dědek will definitely say more on that.
Okay, we are users of the forecast, and we always stressed in our communication that this is the forecast, this is the interest rate path consistent with the forecast. Okay, so it's a kind of input for our decision making. I fully understand. Of course, that Peter can explain. Okay, what is the logic of the forecast? What is the transition mechanism which leads to this kind of interest rate path? We also know that our monetary department always recommends that we should act preemptively. Okay, this kind of preemptive approach is a part of inflation targeting. That's why that's okay. But we always say that this path is not a kind of commitment. Okay, it's only the input for decision making. We are listening to the logic, okay, to the argument of monetary department, and the bank board decides. Therefore, if I can summarize the yesterday decision making, okay, I wouldn't like to send a kind of message that the key point of debate was when we will when we will start consolidation and by how much and like that. Of course, we are more concentrated on the current situation. Okay, the current situation is quite clear. Okay, there is no alternative to exchange rate, to interest rate stability. Okay, our impression is that the inflation expectations are well anchored around the target. the CPI is approaching from above the target. We are quite confident that there is no risk of deflation, so that we will not need to start debating what kind of unorthodox monetary policies we will adopt. Of course, we have debates about this theme, but currently we don't think that we will have to apply them in real life. So that's the answer from the bank board. Okay, so it's not a commitment. Of course, we understand the logic, but it always depends on the incoming informations how we will decide. Therefore, we asked the monetary department, because some members are hawkish, okay, some members are dovish, as usual in the central bank. So we want to ask what will happen, okay, if we will more dovish, okay, than the monetary department is. We saw what the model, what was the response of the model, but it's only the input for the discussion in the bank board. No commitment. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you too. And Magdalena Polan from Legal and General Investment Management is asking you, Mr. Dědek, whether you can elaborate more on the risks to the forecast, and especially factors that would make you delay rate hikes, including whether the foreign exchange rate will be important, or bring the hikes forward.
Okay, I think that the key concerns of the bank board are embodied in this alternative scenario, that the recovery may be longer and may happen longer and will be in a more piecemeal way than expected. So this is the key risk, okay, to the how is it called, the benchmark, okay, the benchmark forecast. So this is the background, okay, above the risk. And if we will see, if the bank board will see or will observe that the true development is approaching to this scenario, so this is a kind of approval, okay, that the interest rate hikes will be rather later than sooner. So I think this is the key risk in our current picture of the Czech economy.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have anything to say? Well, it doesn't seem so. As we have run out of time and questions, let me close this meeting. Thanks to everyone for participating, and see you in May. Goodbye.